It's kind of tough having to follow both Dr. Johnson and Dr. Lanas, but anyways, hopefully I can add a little additional grain of information to think about here. So first I want to start with this beautiful picture of the maroon bells, which I know a lot of people want to go see today, and unfortunately probably won't have this beautiful snow cap, but it'll still be gorgeous, I'm sure. So, all right, kind of the overview real quickly here. I'm going to kind of review the classic view of the vasopressin system, kind of discuss a little bit those evolutionary mechanisms that have been kind of brought up before about conserving water. Address the association of vasopressin and metabolic syndrome that's been recently noted over the last decade, and then reveal novel roles of fructose and vasopressin in metabolic disease, and then propose both adaptive and maladaptive functions of vasopressin and metabolic syndrome, and discuss the impact of climate change on vasopressin and metabolic syndrome in general. So this is an overview. This is right here we have brain right here. This is a schematic view of the major pathways for vasopressin. So basically these three sites, the organum vascularum lamina terminalis and subfornical organ and medium pontifical organ, are pretty important sites where you have a disassociation of the blood-brain barrier that actually allow the brain to sense what your blood osmolarity is. And these sites have stretch receptors that, based upon the osmolarity, send signals to the hypothalamus here, the SON and PVN, to stimulate vasopressin release through here, which is the posterior pituitary. And then here in the brainstem, most notably in the ventral lamina medulla here, and also the nucleus stria terminalis, we receive baroreceptor or signals of blood pressure from various organs throughout the body, get coordinated, and then get also a signal up here also to coordinate vasopressin release. So classically, the stimulants of vasopressin for most people have been a high serum osmolarity and also low blood pressure. Okay. So here's just another schematic view. So here are the neurons of vasopressin located in the hypothalamus in these areas known as SON and PVN. And they project these neurons that store the vasopressin here in the posterior pituitary that get released when either osmolarity goes up or blood pressure goes down, or a combination of the two typically. So here is a schematic of plasma osmolality down here, and also release of vasopressin. So about the mean threshold for vasopressin release is around a blood osmol of 284. The upper limit probably for what we call normal is probably close to about 295. But as you can see, you start releasing this to kind of protect you at this point right here. And obviously if you get very high levels here, then you're releasing a lot more. Same thing with thirst. So this actually kicks in a little bit later, and the mean threshold is about 285. And so the thirst mechanism gets induced as well, so you can not only just release vasopressin, conserve water, but the organism knows I need to get some water to rehydrate. And things can change and shift these things. So for plasma vasopressin, we know that rapid shifts in osmolality can cause a rapid release of vasopressin. Rapid drinking can decrease this rapidly. In pregnancy, the thresholds are lower, and then in aging, vasopressin actually goes up. So there's also a shift of vasopressin release, so it's released at a lower threshold. And then I didn't include it here, but also metabolic syndrome, diabetes, we know there's a shift. And there's some good studies in aging rats showing that an increase in hypothalamic inflammation is driving up osmoreceptors that then cause this shift over so that you have more vasopressin release. And as I'll get into later, might explain why there's a higher risk for dehydration in these population. And then we also have just different things with drinking, stimulates in the mouth and then also in the stomach to reduce thirst. Pregnancy, there's a lower threshold to increase water intake. So kind of what people classically saw as the effects of vasopressin are twofold, acting through this V1A receptor and V2 receptor. So the V1A acts primarily, most people were thinking in the vasculature to increase vascular resistance, and V2 increases water reabsorption by aquaporin channels. in the collecting tubules of the kidney, and then that helps to maintain arterial pressure and maintain your osmolarity at a set point. So kind of getting into water and evolution. So what does the kangaroo rat, the zebra finch, the polar bear, and this ground squirrel all have in common? And you kind of heard it before, but it's metabolic water. So the kangaroo rat lives in a very arid climate, and it has very limited access to water. So it actually relies about 90% of its water from metabolic water. And part of that is from fat stores, but it also lives underground. It only comes out at night. Underground, it's a little bit more humid, so it can conserve water, and actually it collects water that is released when you're breathing and oxidizing. It collects at the nares and then drinks that again. So it has a lot of mechanisms to try to conserve water in arid desert. The zebra finch is a migratory bird, so it also uses fat while it's migrating, so it can maintain flight, going long distances and not having to stop to collect water. And then as Rick talked about, it releases uric acid and thereby can conserve water and not have to use urinate water as well. Then the polar bear eats a high-fat diet. In fact, about 50% of its weight is fat, and the cholesterol levels in the polar bear would actually kill a man. Luckily, it has cholesterol transporters that prevent vascular disease, but during long periods of time, during the winter when it has less access to fresh water, it uses fat stores in part to help maintain that. And then the squirrel here who's hibernating, with the story of hibernation building up fat stores, it releases these fat during hibernation, so it doesn't have to be going out so much to forage for water. So just a kind of reminder, and Rick kind of mentioned this before, so how much water that you obtain from different components. So for fat, you get 107 milliliters per gram of water. Carbohydrates, 55 though. With glycogen, you do have an additional water store that's obligatory. But the problem with storing your energy in glycogen is that you don't have an energy-rich store as fat. So we'd be really huge if we carried everything as glycogen as opposed to fat. So fat's a better energy store in addition to water store. And then protein, in humans, we do make some water, but unfortunately that also has to go to urinate out urea, which is different than the zebra finch here, who doesn't have to do that. He uses primary uric acid and actually from protein breakdown can get water source. So looking at vasopressin levels in metabolic syndrome. So this is from the proteomic markers of atherosclerosis study, looking at markers that might predict the development of cardiovascular disease. This was in African Americans, a non-Hispanic white group, and they looked at various markers related to copeptin, which as we know is a surrogate that you learned about for vasopressin. It's released in equal molar amounts. And that they noted here is that with adjustments for both age, sex, and then other adjustments as well for statin use, physical activity, weight, smoking, that there's a positive correlation with, these are quartiles of copeptin levels, so fourth quartile, third, second, and first. So the rates of cardiovascular disease significantly are higher in patients with higher copeptin values than people with lower copeptin values here, even after adjusting for traditional risk factors in cardiovascular disease. And it crosses both African Americans and whites, suggesting that's not simply a racial diversity, but something that might be common to a lot of people. And then this was a study with the Malmo diet and cancer cardiovascular cohort, looking at whether high copeptin values could predict the onsets of various aspects of metabolic disease. So here's first quartile, second, third, and fourth quartile, so higher levels of copeptin. As you can see here, with very high levels of copeptin value, it actually predicted the onset. So not just associative, but predicted the onset of abdominal obesity, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and microalbuminuria, which is an early marker, especially in diabetic kidney disease. So high levels of copeptin are predictor, not just associative, but predictive with features of metabolic syndrome. So looking at where could vasopressin be playing a role in metabolic syndrome, we have to look at the receptors. And so specifically with these other receptors, V1A and V1B, which are located in more metabolically active tissue. So in the liver, V1A is thought to mainly increased gluconeogenesis in fasting. So when you have a drop in your blood sugar, you have these counter-regulatory hormones, glucagon, catecholamines, vasopressin, coming in to make sure you maintain a certain blood glucose. There's some data, which I'll get into, about inhibiting lipolysis. And then in the hypothalamus, maybe affecting food intake. So it's noted that V1A might affect appetite as well. And then V1B, it's noted that enhances glucagon or insulin secretion based on where your blood sugars are. So if your blood sugars are low, more glucagon. If your blood sugars are a little bit higher, more insulin. Activate release of ACTH, which is a hormone in the pituitary, which then goes on to activate cortisol release, a stress hormone, and then enhance catecholamine release, adrenaline, noradrenaline. So where does fructose and vasopressin kind of come together? So there was a study in 1992 by Wolf who took 8 males and infused them with either 20 or 15% glucose or fructose load. The dark arrows or dark bars here are people who are loaded with glucose, and then they cross them over and load them with fructose. Here's the level of vasopressin release. So at time point 10, and then also at time point 6, they noticed in the fructose groups significant increase in vasopressin release, and didn't see that in the glucose groups. Okay. And so this was even when they took into account for serum osmolarity and checked other parameters of classical vasopressin release, suggesting that fructose in and of itself might be modifying vasopressin release. And then our own study, so this is a study that I did with a group of mice where we injected them with equal amounts of either water, 20% glucose, or fructose, and then put them in 30 minutes dehydration, and then at 1 hour check their vasopressin levels or copeptin levels. And again here, even in the fructose group, I mean, not surprisingly, of course, the water group is going to have lower vasopressin levels, but the fructose group even had significantly higher vasopressin release than even the glucose group, who got equal molar amounts. And then one of our other colleagues did a model with a hypothalamic model where he infused a hypothalamus in a wild-type animal with either fructose or control serum, and then also took a animal that is deficient in the fructose kinase enzyme to metabolize fructose. And here, the wild-type animal on fructose has an increase in its vasopressin release significantly, but the KHK or fructose knockout mouse on fructose is very similar to the wild-type on control medium. So we had a hypothesis. Fructose, as we know, is a nutrient that we talked about that can play a major role in the development of metabolic syndrome and disease. So could fructose's ability to mediate development of metabolic syndrome in part be mediated by vasopressin? So we did a 30-week study, 15% fructose, or in either a V1A knockout mouse, so one that doesn't express the V1A, or a V1B knockout mouse. And so we're going to take a look first at what happened to the vasopressin levels. So first, we wanted to look at what happens in vasopressin in the animals who are deficient in these fructose kinase enzymes. So there's actually 2 enzymes, A and AC. A is kind of ubiquitously expressed throughout the body and is the low affinity for fructose, and C is mainly expressed in the liver, though also some other areas we think as well, and has a higher affinity. So we think we've shown work that the C isoform is probably the important enzyme in the development of metabolic syndrome from fructose. So here, wild-type animals on fructose have significantly higher levels of copeptin. Similar, these KHK8 knockout animals have significantly higher levels of copeptin. But when you put fructose in an animal that has a knockout for both the A and C isoform, despite having fructose, you don't see the same release in vasopressin. So now looking at our copeptin levels in the V1A and V1B. So these animals are not knockouts for fructokinase. They have an intact fructokinase system. And here, again, we see a similar thing. Wild type on fructose have high copeptin values, same with V1A, and same thing happened in the V1B knockout. So if you're on fructose, regardless of these vasopressin receptors, you release more vasopressin. So when we look at the V1A on the water, we see that even V1A knockout animals on water have significantly more weight gain, caloric intake, which corresponds with a higher food intake, and even a little bit more water intake. And then on the fructose, these V1A knockout animals had a higher weight gain, higher caloric intake, chow intake, and fructose intake. So this is oil red stain looking at fat content in liver. So here's the wild type on water. You don't see as big fat droplets. Maybe you start seeing a little bit more fat droplets in the V1A on water, and then significant fat droplets accumulation on the wild type on fructose. And even this, this is almost completely covered in the V1A knockout on fructose. So when we look at the liver fat content, we can see that all the wild type on fructose and V1A on fructose have significant higher levels of liver triglycerides and fat content. But even this V1A on water and normal chow has a tendency for higher fat and liver fat content. And then looking at some serum markers, so looking here, we can see that serum insulin levels, fasting levels are higher in the wild type on fructose, the 1A on water, and the 1A fructose compared to the wild type, which led to this higher, what we call HOMA-IR, which is the index of insulin sensitivity. They are much higher again on the wild type on fructose in both the V1A animals compared to the wild type on water, and a tendency for higher glucagon values as well. And then leptin levels, which Dr. Lanasma talked about, these were significantly higher in all three groups of animals compared to the wild type on water. And another group out of Japan also showed in fat that these animals at baseline, these knockout animals, the V1A knockout animals, so this is isoproterenol, which is a known catecholamine stimulant of lipolysis. And they noted that these animals have exacerbated lipolysis and decreased insulin sensitivity in the fat. So this is phosphorylated AKT, which is a marker of insulin signaling. So you can see here the intact animals had higher levels of phosphorylated AKT versus the knockouts, which did not. This is even at baseline, even prior to putting them on like a high fat or high fructose diet. So now I'm kind of looking at the V1B animals here. We can see that the V1B animal on water is very similar weight gain, a little bit less caloric intake here, and maybe a little bit higher water intake. And when we put them on fructose, there was a significant drop-off in weight gain versus the wild type on fructose here. They had a less caloric intake, which was mainly mediated by less food intake. But interestingly, they had higher fructose intake. So despite this high fructose intake, they did not gain as much weight as the wild type on fructose. And then looking at the liver fat content here, here's the wild type on water, V1B on water, and then amazingly here, this V1B knockout on fructose. No significant fat content in the liver versus this wild type on fructose here, which had much higher fat content, which we can see right here. So, and then looking at these serum parameters, again, the V1B seems to be protected from hyperinsulinemia, insulin resistance, elevations in glucagon, and elevations in leptin compared to the wild type on fructose. And then we also wanted to see, we saw some worsening features in the V1A even on water, so we wanted to know what was going on in the V1A in the liver of these other animals. So we noticed here that the V1A seems to be downregulated in this wild type on fructose, but protected in the V1B and wild type. And other people have noted also in diabetic and obese models that this V1A receptor seems to be downregulated. So this is a DB mouse that's prone for diabetes, a reduction in this V1A receptor expression. And then there's another group that looked at vasopressin specifically in the liver and its ability to regulate fatty acid synthesis. So looking at lean mice, when you infuse with vasopressin, there's a decrease in production of fatty acid synthesis in lean mouse, but there doesn't appear to be that same drop-off. It's 29, remains pretty high here, and there's no drop-off with the same infusion of vasopressin here, unlike the lean animals. So that lists kind of a couple major overviews about fructose and metabolism and vasopressin metabolism. First, fructose has been found to be a novel mediator of vasopressin release, which is unlike glucose. Then, two, the V1A receptor appears to play a protective role in metabolic disease. It appears to improve insulin sensitivity, especially in the fat, and possibly protect from fatty liver development. And the V1B appears to play a deleterious role in development of metabolic syndrome. So this could be possibly through activation of insulin, glucagon, maybe using ACTH or cortisol. We didn't have enough serum to measure these endpoints, but some possibilities here. And then finally, a big one we're thinking about is that the loss of the V1A receptor may be an important role in the progression of obesity, insulin resistance, and fatty liver, suggesting that this is a type of vasopressin resistance going on. So kind of getting more at the adaptive role, which Rick kind of got into before. He talked about 15 million years ago, this period of cooling, and the season changes where now you had periods of fasting, so you have to adapt to these as a survival advantage. So fructose, both by raising uric acid and by activating vasopressin, promote fat storage and insulin resistance. And then vasopressin, specifically acting through the V1A, will improve insulin's ability to store fat appropriately in fat, not in other tissues like liver, pancreas, muscle, where you get disease from. So kind of looking at the adaptive role, fructose activating through the hypothalamus, activating vasopressin, will help to reabsorb water, block fat accumulation in the liver, promote insulin secretion, and then with insulin promote fat storage appropriately here for periods of starvation. But when you get a maladaptive role, and I'll kind of just get to this kind of quickly because I know I'm running out of time here, if too much fructose intake increases in vasopressin, this over time is going to lead to kidney damage through oxidative stress. And then with the loss of V1A through fructose metabolism, you get inappropriate liver production, or fat production in the liver, inappropriate glucose production because of loss of insulin sensitivity, excessive insulin secretion, which drives the fat production, and inappropriate glucagon secretion, which then drives glucose production, and then the loss of insulin sensitivity at fat, which then promotes fatty acids to be released in the blood into other organs, which then promote inflammation and insulin resistance, and high levels of cortisol, which also promote that as well. So kind of getting a final little thing here, I just wanted to kind of bring it back to the epidemiologists in the room who probably were falling asleep with all that science stuff. So this was a study done by Adam Dranowski at obesity and supermarket access. Is it based on proximity to the supermarket or price? And so this was done with the Seattle Obesity Study Group, looking at a total of 1,682 patients, with some obese and majority non-obese. And they tried to determine where did you go, was it your closest shopping center or not? And they found out that only 1 in 7 people went to the closest shopping center, so is it based on price where you go? So what they found out was that, yes, that based upon price, and these are social, okay, I lost the pointer here. Yeah, these are in different social economic category indexes. So 1 is less than 50,000 without college education. 2 is greater than 50,000 but still no college education. 3 is you have a college education and you have 50,000 to 100,000 is your median income. 4 is you have a college, education, but you make 50,000 to 100,000, and 5 is that you both have college education and you make more than 100,000. So basically, category 5 is you're well educated and make a lot of money, and category 1 is you don't have good education and you're poor. And you can see here that there are significant differences in percentage based upon your socioeconomic background, that you're going to probably go to a lower price shopping center than a higher price shopping center. And if you're obese, you're probably going to go to a lower price shopping center than a higher price shopping center. And they looked at rates of obesity based upon other factors that are common, like age, sex, gender, physical activity in these different bivariates. And so the likelihood of you having obesity went down with the higher price supermarket you went to, okay? So basically, that just kind of, the conclusion from that study is that if you are poor and not well educated, you're going to go to a lower price shopping market and you're probably going to be obese. Basically kind of linking the two of processed foods and not eating vegetables and stuff with obesity. So to conclude here, organisms have developed biological adaptations over millions of years in response to climate changes in order to promote energy and water balance. Fructose and vasopressin seem to appear to be 2 important components in this adaptation. But unfortunately, in our current day and age, with abundant caloric intake and sedentary lifestyle, this has led to a dysregulation of the system, which leads to metabolic diseases. And then climate changes might aggravate play a role in aggravation of metabolic disease, especially in low socioeconomic backgrounds, even in developed countries. So, take questions.
We have any questions? I'll just make a quick comment. So dehydration activates vasopressin, but it also stimulates endogenous fructose production, both in the kidney and in the liver. So when you're dehydrated, you raise your serum osmolality, your body makes fructose. And we can show in various systems that that's enough to cause obesity, it's enough to cause kidney damage, and so forth. And you've now shown that fructose actually drives vasopressin. Dietary fructose drives vasopressin. So there's a link between sugar intake, vasopressin, and dehydration.
Yeah.
And that linkage is complicated, but you can enter it at any direction. So if you take a high salt diet to create high serum osmolality, it's the same effect as being dehydrated. So there's this link between sugar, salt, dehydration, and they drive this fructose, and they drive vasopressin, and you can show that vasopressin is driving metabolic syndrome through the V1b receptor. And so this is kind of a linkage now that's bringing together serum osmolarity with obesity and metabolic syndrome, as well as with kidney disease. So this is the key aspect of this science.
Yeah. And what also was brought up earlier about the risk of dehydration, it is true that obese and diabetics are at higher risk. And it's not just because of loss of sugar, but like I said, when you're chronically releasing more vasopressin, you have less stores in the pituitary. So your ability then to augment during a time of stress with dehydration is less. That's why people, one of the reasons why elderly are at higher risk for dehydration and why obese people, it's a little bit more complicated, there's more factors, but that's one of the reasons, because they don't have as much stores then to compensate during times of stress.
So I have a question for you. So in these animals that live in the desert, many of them have high fat stores, they have high vasopressin stores. But you showed that you didn't really show what vasopressin does to a normal animal that's in terms of fat. You just looked at vasopressin through V1A knock, you showed what fructose does. So, but the question is, in the normal state, is vasopressin protecting against fat or driving?
So I think in the normal state, when you don't have this energy imbalance, vasopressin helps to appropriately store fat. Okay, when you lose that V1A receptor, though, then those protective effects go out of the way. This is important as an adaptation. So for instance, in the ground squirrel, so in hibernation, during hibernation, vasopressin drops, okay? And then it starts to come up again actually after hibernation, because vasopressin has also been found important in foraging and also social interactive behaviors and mating behaviors as well. Okay, so I don't want to get into the whole psychosocial thing of vasopressin, but it's found to be important. And so insulin resistance is a protective mechanism for surviving starvation. Why is that? Because insulin, we're always releasing insulin when we have, glucose. It almost never goes down to zero unless you're extremely low in your glucose. So during points of starvation, your body doesn't want insulin to store things. It wants to release energy. And so by creating insulin resistance, it promotes the breakdown of fat, leading to that lipolysis I told you. So you're not storing fat anymore. And then it shunts those fatty acids primarily to the liver, which then converts it into energy. Then you make a small amount of glucose for redox reactions, for reactive oxidation species that happens with that. And it protects your protein. You don't want to be breaking down protein during the starvation, because if you do that, then when food comes around again, you won't have the ability to go get it. Okay? So insulin resistance is an adaptive mechanism in evolution to protect us during starvation, but it doesn't quite work well when we have food all the time and we're still building that up. So my theory is that vasopressin helps to promote fat storage during these times of food being plenty, and then with that going up, that you have a loss of the V1A, promotes insulin resistance in preparation for starvation. The problem is we are not going through starvation modes.
All right.
One quick question regarding the increased osmolality and
Yeah.
vasopressin release. if you look at the osmolality rise because of dehydration, vasopressin goes up.
Yeah.
But if you look at the other paradigm, like if you take more sugar, it also increases osmolality, but you have diuresis. Whereas the vasopressin will not be released because you take more sugar content fluid, you go to more pee, more urination. So how do you explain this paradox?
Yeah, so in diabetics, they've done studies in diabetics where they've even controlled for their blood sugar and got them down to a normal blood sugar as the rest of us, and found that typical stimulants like nicotine and other things of vasopressin are augmented in those patients. And when you infuse with glucose, you might not necessarily see a raise in the vasopressin, but in these studies that we've done, we've seen that that's been true in fructose. And the reason is that it possibly is that glucose over time can shift into the brain, and then that can kind of maybe ultimately raise osmolarity of the brain at the same time, and so therefore block that effect. The second thing is that even though vasopressin might have to go up for that diuresis, your concentrating ability in the kidney is still maintained. If in fact it's enhanced in diabetics, they have an enhanced ability prior to development of diabetes to retain water.
We've actually done studies at the Barbara Davis Center. Diabetics have high vasopressin levels, and the vasopressin levels correlate with bad outcomes. Not every diabetic has a high vasopressin, but they have higher vasopressin levels than normal people, and they may still have high urine output because of glycosuria, but it doesn't. They have the high vasopressin that predicts poor outcomes. So.
Yeah, and they have a shift in their release, like I was talking about.
And diabetics also make fructose, and Miguel had a Nature Communication paper showing. Jason paper showing that diabetic nephropathy is driven by glucose conversion to fructose, and if you block the fructose pathway, you actually block the diabetic nephropathy. All right, well, this got pretty complicated. I think we're all ready for a coffee break.
And a photo.